1.
0.
0.
All right. Good afternoon, Central European time. It is 4 o'clock in the Netherlands. Welcome back all, or welcome from wherever you are. My name is Eric Vermetten. I have the incredible pleasure to moderate this session. I'm a psychiatrist from the Netherlands, from Leiden University Medical Center. And with me here on this panel are Michael Meethofer, who I guess does not really need a further introduction, but he will introduce himself in a minute, and Pedram Dara, who will introduce himself too. First, Pedram, do you want to introduce yourself before we go back to Michael? And Michael has a PowerPoint presentation I'd like to share, but can you introduce yourself first?
Yes, sure. Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, I think you said my name. So yes, I was living in Montreal, Canada, up until about a year ago. And that's where I was enrolled in a phase 2 study of the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD as part of the training for the therapists. So it was an open label phase 2 study. I think I was lucky to be enrolled in that. And I ever since then, obviously, completely different life. So to just a little bit of recap, I was living with PTSD for 15 years. I wasn't really sure what it was. So just kind of suffering in silo. And then probably what really pushed me out of my comfort zone of even pain, I would say, is becoming a father. When I became a parent, I think just the whole parenting challenges, the lack of sleep, it really pushed me out of the zone, which probably was a good thing, because then it allowed me to take action finally towards healing, finally towards owning it. So it just happened to be that in that moment, they were looking for a participant, and I applied, and I didn't give up. It was a very, very rigorous process to get into it. And so I feel completely privileged and lucky that I was chosen as the one in that moment. And that study went on until June of 2019. And ever since then, I'm still trying to really integrate what happened into my day-to-day life, because I feel like a brand new person again. So
thanks for being on this panel and for your willingness to share your experiences, which are very personal. But you've done this before, and you joined this panel because you just want to educate and share
yes.
what could be important for other people as well. And I can remember I saw your video of your, let's call that 1 year anniversary or so.
Yeah.
And you posted it on YouTube, where you were very cheerful and happy somewhere in Ibiza, and reflecting how that year has
It
passed.
was a couple of months before the lockdown and the COVID stuff, so probably was the peak of my journey before I had my dip again, which I'll probably share more about that too.
Yeah. Well, this session is about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, and to contextualize that, no one can do that better, I think, than the one who started all this. Is not Rick Doblin. Of course, he started it way before Michael, but you gave it the kickstart with a 2011 paper that we all cherish now. And actually, I heard Ben Sessa say in this conference that there is a Michael Meethofer effect, or something of that kind, and I think that's building a legacy on your name, Michael. I don't know whether you want to preserve that or so, or comment on that, but allow me to introduce you, or do you want to introduce yourself and then start the slideshow?
Up to you, Eric. As far as the Mithofer thing, my main thing would be either change it to anti-Mithofer effect or debunk it altogether. As much as I appreciate the support, we've proven in the study that Pedram was in that many other therapists can do this too with MDMA, and now we're going to have more data soon about phase 3. So thank you, but we'll pass on that name.
We'll debunk it for now, Michael. So go ahead and share your screen.
But Pedram, I just want to express my appreciation too for your willingness to share. Obviously we wouldn't be able to do this research at all if it weren't for courageous people like you willing to volunteer. And then the fact that you're willing to share your experience is so meaningful. So it's really
likewise. I want to also take this opportunity. I mentioned this last week in the other conference with Rick Dublin, that I read every single word of that 80-page PDF of your protocol. And probably, I don't even know if my therapist read every single word of it, but I have. And I can tell you, like, it played a huge role. So definitely, this is an honor to be even here in front of you. So thank you so much
Thank you.
for doing everything you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Michael.
Yeah, so, I've been doing MAPS research for about 20 years now, from when I first had this first discussion with Rick about the first protocol that we ended up doing. So it's been an incredible journey that I've had the privilege to participate in. And Annie, my wife Annie, and I have done some of the phase 2 trials. And then now we're actually switching mainly to focusing on training and supervision, as well as reviewing all these many investigator-initiated trials. We're getting people from all over the world want to do studies and other things using the MAPS MDMA, which is very exciting. So we're a lot going on in that realm. So I wanted to give a whirlwind update about the MDMA research. Do you want me to just go into that, Eric? Or
please do so. Yeah.
Okay.
Some people may have been very experienced in where we are, but it'd be good for the people who are relatively new to this to familiarize them with where we are.
Yes, I'll do that quickly, and then I'll go on to a little bit of new stuff. So here we are in Amsterdam again.
Yep.
So this is about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD that we've been studying, and this is this. I can't keep up with the slide. There are like 3 times as many people now working at MAPS and MPBC. So it's a tremendous effort by so many people working hard, and all supported by donors, no government or industry funding. So it's really an amazing effort by all these people that work so hard every day to make it possible. So here's where we are. We started working on the first protocol in early 2000. We got FDA approval for our first phase 2 study that Annie and I did in Charleston in November 2001. And then since then, it took a few more years to get the DEA, all the other approvals, DEA and IRB. But then we got started with that first study in April 2004. And as of 2016, MAPS had completed 6 phase 2 clinical trials in 5 different sites in 4 different countries. And that data was so promising that it led to the FDA granting not only breakthrough therapy designation as we went on to phase 3, but a special agreement about the adequacy of the study design for phase 3. So that's where we are now. This was after our first in-person meeting in FDA when we were celebrating. So here's where we are now. We just finished the first phase 3 trial with 16 sites in North America. There's your site pattern over there in Montreal, and 2 sites in Israel. These are all active, have all been active, and just finished phase 3, the first phase 3. We also have approval for expanded access protocol to give some clinical use outside of the phase 3 trials in the US and Israel. That hasn't started yet, but it's approved. Phase 2 in Europe is now recruiting in Netherlands and Czech Republic, and soon to come in other countries. And the phase 3 protocol that will follow that in Europe is at various stages of review in about 7 UK and probably 7 different European countries. So the last treatment of the last person was in August, just a few weeks ago, in the first phase 3 study. So it's right now the database is being checked, and unblinding will probably happen in October, and then we'll know the results of the pivotal first phase 3 trial. So just a brief recap of what's been published. I won't go into detail because you can read it, but one point to make for those of you that don't know, this is kind of a basic skeleton of the design of all the studies with some variation, but the main point is those 3 pink circles are the only times people receive MDMA-assisted therapy in all-day sessions with 2 therapists. And then the green lines are the preparation sessions and the follow-up sessions for integration, which are extremely important. It's not just about what happens in the MDMA sessions at all. And people are randomized in phase 3 to MDMA plus psychotherapy, or the same psychotherapy with the same all-day sessions with inactive placebo. And in phase 2, sometimes it was low-dose MDMA. So these are the 6 phase 2 studies that have been finished. Those 4 have been published. And these are the papers, some of the papers. Our first study in Charleston was the one about crime-related PTSD. And then we did a 42-month follow-up paper from that. Then we did a subsequent study with veterans and first responders. And then these are the studies in Switzerland and Boulder, Colorado, which had mixed populations of causes of PTSD. And so last year we published the pooled results of those papers I showed before were individual results. Then we published the pooled results, and we found a large effect size of 0.8 and 0.9 after 2 and 3 sessions. And that was compared to all the same intensive therapy. So it wasn't just a placebo control, it was an intensive therapy control. This is a graph. The top line is either inactive placebo or low dose comparator MDMA, and the bottom line with a much bigger, this is the clinician administered PTSD scale, the PTSD symptom rating scale. So it's a much bigger drop. You can see some drop with the therapy alone, even in people who had failed other treatment, but much bigger drop with MDMA. Then we did a subsequent paper not long ago with a long-term follow-up of a year or later, a year or more afterwards, after the last treatment in those 6 studies. And what we found was all these people had to have had prior treatment and still had significant PTSD. And with all that intensive therapy, 23% no longer met criteria for PTSD with just the therapy with placebo, but it was 56% with MDMA. And this is not just improvement, this is people who lost the diagnosis. And one of the interesting things that we see consistently is it was even higher at 1 year or more. So you already mentioned that briefly, Pedram. The benefit from most people seems to continue growing afterwards, which is a pretty nice feature of a treatment. So that's what we've done. So now I'm going to show you very quickly some unpublished data, which we hope will be published soon. This was a small sub-study we did with our study with veterans and first responders. We had funding only to do MRI on 10 of the people, and we did it before treatment and then 1 to 2 months after treatment with 3 active dose MDMA sessions. By that time, there was no control group of no MDMA, because by that time everyone had crossed over to receive MDMA. But what we did was people recorded trauma script, their own description of their own trauma, and then a neutral script, and we would record that with them in the office. And then the scanning researchers would play those 2 different tapes in random order in the scanner. And what we saw was, interestingly, the left picture is before MDMA-assisted therapy, the right is afterwards. And we saw significantly less trauma script-induced activity in the posterior cingulate and medial prefrontal cortex, 2 parts of the brain. I won't go into all the detail, but that's the part that lit up when people were talking about the trauma script and experiencing it, and it didn't light up the same way at all after the treatment. And interestingly, there was no difference in the response to the neutral script. So it wasn't just that people got used to the scanner or something. They responded to the neutral script the same way after treatment, but not to the trauma script. And there's a lot of work, especially Robin Carr Harris's lab and others are doing a lot of work with imaging. And there's a lot of data about the importance of the changes in the default mode network that happen with MDMA and these other compounds. And so these are both parts of that default mode network. So it's very small numbers and preliminary, but it's intriguing data that goes along with what we saw clinically. And sort of icing on the cake, again, very small numbers, so it needs to be repeated, and you're going to do more imaging in the Netherlands soon. So but we also noticed that there was this significant correlation between the decrease in the CAPS scores and the decrease in response on the neural script. So that kind of suggests that it has some meaning. So anyway, it'll be exciting to follow up on that. And this is another paper that is in review, and we hope it'll be published very soon. We looked at in 4 of the 6 phase 2 studies, we did Beck depression inventory. So we wanted to look at the influence on Beck depression inventory as well as PTSD. So we took those 4 studies that had both of those measures. And what we looked at was the design was virtually everybody had taken an antidepressant, an SSRI or SNRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Virtually everyone had been on those at some time, but quite a few people, I can't remember the numbers, but a significant number had already stopped it quite long before coming to the study. Others were on it and had to be tapered off right before starting the study with just, a slow taper and then a couple of weeks to adjust. So we wondered, in other words, it's recent exposure to SSRIs versus more remote exposure to SSRIs. And we wondered if there was a difference in response. And what we saw was this. This is the improvement on the CAPS on the left, the PTSD improvement, and on the Beck depression inventory on the right, the depression improvement. And both the oranges, people who had recently tapered off SSRIs or SNRIs to be in the study, versus the gray line, which they had not. And both groups improved significantly, but you can see there was a significantly more improvement in the people who had not recently been on SSRIs and SNRIs. And we weren't surprised there was some effect because of receptor downregulation takes a long time to recover, but we were surprised at the magnitude of the effect. And also, so those were significant, and there was no significant difference between the groups at baseline. And there was, you can see, highly significant difference in both the CAPS and the BDI. And the other interesting part is we also saw significantly less increase in blood pressure in the group that had recently tapered off too. And those were statistically significant. And it's not on the slides, but when we looked at the response to the therapy alone, because half the people or not half, but a third of the people had been, half to a third, depending on the study, had been randomized first to therapy only. And there was no difference in how much they responded to the therapy only a difference in how much they respond to the therapy when there was MDMA. So that's pretty interesting data. And we'll find out more about that in our phase 3 numbers soon with larger numbers. How are we doing with time, Eric?
We're at 16:20.
So
just a few minutes because
I stop there. Okay, I'll just mention these really quickly. Yeah, actually, I didn't start at 0, so maybe I got a couple minutes. So just mention this study, a pilot study we did with couples. Annie and I did with Ann Wagner, who's speaking at this meeting, and Candace Monson from Toronto. And we combined their method of cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, working with a couple who has PTSD, which is Candace developed that treatment. And we combined that, we embedded a couple of MDMA sessions in a course of CBCT. And just to cut to the chase, it was an open label, so no control group. We didn't prove anything, but we did see very robust effect sizes in CAPS improvement as reported by the person who had PTSD and as reported by their partner. And in this study, both people received MDMA at the same time twice. We worked with a couple together. So it was a way that we got permission from FDA to give MDMA to 2 people, one of whom didn't have a diagnosis. And we also saw big improvements in relationship satisfaction. So Anne is about to start a control trial in Toronto with CPT with individuals, comparing it with and without MDMA. And then they plan to do another one with couples after that. So the last point I want to make is this, a a plug for not being reductionist in thinking. So, what we've noticed, we take a non-directive or inner-directed approach, directed by the participant, to just have an open mind about what their experience will be. And what we see is when we do that, all these different elements that tend to come up in other therapies seem to come up to different degrees and in different order for each individual. So it's very striking how if you aren't too directive, people will find what they need to, their inner healing intelligence will bring them to the experience they need. And so that's when, we think this is kind of validation for why the inner directed approach is a good way to go. Not the only way, but a good way. And I've written an article, this was 7 years ago now, but if you want to read more thoughts about that. So basically, I think if we try to, there can be a temptation to, of course, it's really interesting and important to look at mechanisms, and there's a lot of work going on about that. And we'll learn more and more. And it's important not to be reductionist. It's tempting to think, oh, it works by enhancing imaginal exposure. It works because of memory reconsolidation or fear extinction. All of those are probably seem to be true. So one thing we're learning is that it can't be reduced to something simple, I think. So we need to pay attention to that fact, not lose sight of the forest for the trees. And this is just an example of one veteran's process, not the details, but just the kind of things that happen. So you can kind of see the richness of this journey that he took. First, he kind of made friends with his defenses, his protectors. And the squares with green lines around them are when the MDMA was administered. The ones without green lines are the integration sessions. So he had a powerful experience of making friends or with respecting his protectors, his warrior part. He then did powerful imaginal exposure about some of his trauma. He was having a powerful experience afterwards, but he needed a lot of time for integration and time by himself, which caused challenges in his marriage. And so we worked with that in integration, and he did some self-expression through art, and that was very healing for the relationship. The next MDMA session, he went to transference issues and childhood psychodynamic issues, then processed more about his moral injury in Iraq. Then he had kind of a blob period where he got feeling down and kind of like he wanted to die. And then he had a powerful catharsis and finally cried. And then afterwards, he was concerned maybe he'd lost his defenses. And so we processed that, and he did powerful work with some somatic processing of rage, and that really helped with that and led to greater enjoyment and self-care, taking better care of himself. And then in the next session, he processed some more moral injury from Iraq. And with that came some powerful archetypal imagery, kind of a shamanistic quality of dismemberment and reintegration. Then he had a powerful experience of kind of reconnecting with his young self and memory reconsolidation about his whole war experience in a different light. Then he had a powerful mystical experience of oneness with everything, and which led to a very powerful session of compassion for the people he'd been fighting and their shared values. And that led to really a different perspective about the war and his whole healing process. He looked back on it and he felt a lot of self-love where he'd had self-judgment, much more joy and appreciation of his life in his final session. And he ended up by saying, I'm happy to be alive and grateful for the experience. So this is just to make the point that if you give it a chance, many deep and profound, interesting things will happen that might not happen if you're too focused on, you just got to process this index trauma. So
thank you.
Reductionist thinking. That's it. That's where we'll all be working soon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, for taking us in that individualized journey or so that you just shared with the beautiful forest at the background. And I want to save some time for Pedram because otherwise Pedram is time limited and save the Q&As. There's a couple that I've shared on the Q&A, but we'll leave them for now. We could go on after this session is over in a smaller room there where all the questions could be addressed to you, Michael, and leave the floor for your personal experience, because it's unique that we have that and you're willing to share how it is from a participant perspective. Now, Michael has set the time perspective and sort of the historical upbringing of this, but how is it? What do you want to share with us when you were in Ibiza and you flew all the way to Montreal to get?
No, I was actually living in Montreal already. So the
Right.
move to Spain, the move to Spain was kind of as a byproduct of the healing, you know. So yeah, I was just living in Canada for 15 years.
Take us through your journey, Pedram. The floor is yours.
Sure.
Yeah.
I arrived so at the age of 20, I left my home country and I arrived to Canada as a refugee after a 10-week traumatic experience, I would say. That's probably what caused most of what in your world they call index trauma. And I think it was just like prolonged exposure to fear for a very long time. And obviously not knowing what was happening, you know, I was just in a survival mode probably for the entire that 10 weeks, you know, these feelings of, oh, I'm probably gonna die every day. So even when I did arrive to Canada safely, finally, I don't think I had the tools that I needed to deal with it. So I kind of, for lack of a better term, I manned up and I just pushed everything down, and then just I went for different coping mechanisms. So, you know, first was work and then study and then relationships. I looked for everything outside of myself. And when all that fell apart and that went on, I think I had periods where like life was good, and then there would always be an enemy, you know, like I would always look for an enemy, and then something outside of me that would make me feel like a victim. I would not feel safe, and then I would think that I have to escape. So I would just repeat this pattern of just there's an enemy out there and I need to escape that enemy.
Can I interrupt you? Because to contextualize, where did you come from, or where were you living before you went? Iran.
Yes.
Okay. So
yes.
how long had you been living in Iran before?
Until I was 20.
20. And
so
where
at the age of 20, this journey started.
Okay.
So the kind of like the moral of the story is that I escaped the dictator outside of me just to find one inside of me. So I think really what for me the biggest lesson was that I felt like I was living in this prison. Turns out the prison was inside of me. So once I started noticing this pattern, that is like, oh, you know, like that's probably what it is, right? So back to the inner directive approach and all of that. I think without that, I would have never arrived to these insights.
Yeah. But just one additional question. Did you leave Iran on your own, or were you with a group?
Yes, on my own. Yes, pretty much all on my own alone. Yeah. So once that journey was done and I arrived, and then, you know, like I just went on with life. I didn't really look after my mental health. And then things just started to get worse and worse and worse as more challenges came up, you know, like I went through different challenges, different jobs. I think I changed like 12 jobs in a period of 7-8 years. You know, I changed houses. I just never felt safe anywhere. And that continued. I couldn't trust anyone. And then, like I said earlier, once I became a parent, then things just like blew up completely from that point, you know, like I think that's when, for most people, the first 2 years of becoming a parent is probably the sweetest time. For me, it happened to some of the darkest moments of my life. And that's when I think I became completely suicidal, and I just lost hope, and I just couldn't connect with my daughter. She was like a piece of furniture. There was I was so numb that I couldn't even see. I had no feelings. So for me, there was the ultimate escape would have been to kill myself and be done with it, right? Because that was my pattern. So not because I couldn't see joy. Sometimes I would see it, but I just couldn't see a way out of it. So I was just like, well, I guess if life ends, that probably would be the end of suffering, because I didn't know there was any other way.
And then I know that we're cutting corners here in this short period of time. How did you learn about the opportunity to seek help by
Yeah,
MD?
interesting. So on one of my really, really low down days, and I think I just blew up, I had thrown like a plate to the wall in front of my wife. And that's like the most violent I think I ever got. I had crazy rage episodes. And then, so she grabs our daughter, she walks out of the house. I mean, it's a longer story, but that's the shorter version. And when I was left at home just to distract myself, which I used to do, right? So I just start grabbing my phone and I'm just scrolling. I suddenly see an article that's talking about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. I had heard of both of those terms before, but never together. And then something inside of me click, I'm reading, and that was the first time that I saw the sign, that every single symptom. And I was like, wow, this is exactly my life. Like, this is like, I could finally see as a mirror that, oh, wow, like maybe I'm not alone, right? So I think it was just that. And then one thing, you know, next thing you know, I'm clicking, I end up on the research website of US government. And then I just see a phone number that was the area code of the city that I was living, where they said they were looking for a participant. And I was like, wow, I live here, really? So I just, again, compulsive actions, which I was using all the time. I just called the number up. I'm like, hey, like it was the therapist's office. And then of course he didn't answer. So it was just a voicemail. I'm like, I'm feeling suicidal. Things are really bad. I just found out about this. I have no idea if this could help me, but that's it. And then I just hung up in fear, because I was like, oh, psychiatrists are people in white coats and they take you to like mental health hospitals. And I thought like, this is only gonna get worse now, right? Luckily, he called me back a couple of times finally until I answered, and then a bunch of phone calls. And then finally, I think in a matter of 2-3 days, he asked me to come to the office. I go to their office again, thinking I'm going to a mental health hospital. Turned out to be a completely opposite setting of that. And I think that was the beginning of me feeling safe in an environment and with other people. And although that very first day, they took me around like 400 different questions. I think it was like 4 or 5 hour session. By the end of it, they told me like, yes, obviously, you tend to qualify for this, but we just don't know if it will be you, we'll get back to you, blah, blah, but just in case, go and do the blood test and your urine test and all that. So I walked out of that office that day actually feeling worse. I felt like if they told me that, like, if I had cancer, but it was in my soul and there was no solution yet. So it was actually just this much glimpse of hope left in me that I was like, okay, I might as well just go through it and do it. So that process took 3-4 months until I had this one late night call. And then the therapist said, yes, we're going ahead and you're going to have your first experimental session. And that was in January of 2019. So I'm glad I didn't give up. And kudos to my partner, I think my wife, for cheering me on, because I had moments of like, it's a very rigorous process to get into this study. I think I mentioned before, I think it's harder than getting the US green card. So I had moments of like, no, I'm not going to do it. This is really hard. I don't even know if in the end I'll get it or not. So I'm glad I didn't give up.
Now, I know, Pedram, there's probably a zillion questions to be asking to you at this moment of time, but we have about 10 minutes or so for this shortcut. Could you give us some insight or highlights of things that were important for us, or could be important for us to learn from your experience?
Yes. So I'll just start on talking, since I was talking about my wife. I'll just start with that was something that I think was definitely missing from the process and protocol. And I know why, because obviously it's all about trying to do this at a big scale with a cost that is obviously coming from donations. So I get it, but which is why I'm really interested in the work that Anne Wagner is doing and doing this with partners, because there's no one else who suffers more when someone has a PTSD than their partner. And to not include them, although like I think I told that to Anne too, I'm like, as much as I was jealous that I'm like, maybe I should have gone to that study, I don't think now I wanted to do it. I think I needed to do my individual healing work. So I'm hoping one day there will be a protocol or a mix of protocols where like the person with PTSD can do their own individual healing work, but they also get a chance to do some of that with their partner. Because I carried on this guilt for a very long period of time for like the horrible things that I had said to her, the things that I've done to her. And I feel like I didn't know how to deal with that. So as I started developing more self-love for myself, understanding, and even to this day, I continue that guilt, the damage that I have done that I don't even know how to undo. And so yes, that would be something that, although my therapists were incredible, they did their best out of even going out of their way to make sure that, there's some support for her, but it wasn't as part of the study, of course.
Now, Pedro, I'm sorry if I interrupt again, but,
Sure, no.
Michael just shared that forest picture where
Yes.
superimposed were sort of the trajectories from his experience with some patients. Did you recognize some elements, or could you walk us through
Yes.
some of the elements that
Yes, I could.
from your
Actually, it was very interesting because definitely a huge overlap. I think it was a lot. Looks like if he had more than 3 experimental sessions. I don't know, Michael can't say it, but from my point of view, it looks like if there was.
Yeah, he got randomized to 75 milligrams first, 75 plus 37.5. But then in that study, the crossover went to 125. So he's one of the few people that got 6 sessions of active dose, but his PTSD
Yeah.
was gone after the 3 sessions with 75.
Okay. So probably I think he had a much like kind of deeper experience than I did, and that probably had to do with maybe just more sessions. But I could recognize almost like 70% of that in myself too. I went completely through almost the same thing. So it's so interesting that as humans, that's what we really all share. So I think major takeaway for me was that what this study or this protocol allowed me or gave me was a set of tools to cope with life. I went to it thinking I was a broken car and the psychiatrist is a mechanic. That was my understanding. And actually, it's a funny story on my child. I don't know if Simon, I think he'll be okay probably with it, but it was on my second experimental session. I walk into the office, and this is a pre-coronavirus. So he had a regular flu. So my psychiatrist had a regular flu. He thought he is in control. Turns out it started to get really worse overnight. And everything was ready to go for the session. So I arrived in there, and he was like not in his best at all, right? And I'm still thinking, oh, okay, I'm a broken car, and here we are. The mechanic is sick right now, like it's kind of like, how is he gonna help me out now? And I started actually building resentment, before taking the MDMA. And then I think halfway through the session, I took the headphones and the eye shades out, and then I just looked. I saw the other therapist there, and then there was the psychiatrist. He was like lying down on the floor, like he was completely out, like useless, I could say, for lack of a better term. And instead of that turning me off, I felt this sense of empowerment. I was like, oh, wait a second. Maybe he's not a mechanic. Maybe I'm not a broken car. Like I finally understood this inner directive thing that they were talking. I'm like, oh, wait a second. Maybe I'm doing the healing work. They're just keeping me safe. It just clicked for me in that moment. So something that started as like a really bad experience turned out to be one of the highlights of my journey. And then from that point on, I think that just empowered me, although it was not planned. Maybe for the next version of the protocol, we could add that to it. But it ended up really empowering me. I walked out of that session feeling like, oh, wow, like, I have actually some control here. So I think, again, that inner directive approach is really, that's what it brings that out of a participant, this sense of self-empowerment.
Now, Pedro, you also said in the beginning of your story that you didn't feel safe anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And that sense of safety was very important. How has that changed if you look back on where you are now?
First of all, I'm aware of it, right? So before I was never even aware. So now I'm not saying that there are moments I just feel safe everywhere. No, there are moments that I still don't feel safe today, but I have awareness around it. So now I recognize that as a pattern in myself. So I know, well, I probably lived that way for a very long time. My brain was developing. It probably shaped to be that way. So I have to accept that I'm continuing to live with that. But now I have new pathways that I get a choice now. Right? Before it felt like if there was no choice. Now I'm like, oh, I could go the old way, or I could recognize that, oh, that's my pattern. And now I have other tools, I can do other things. So I think that's really what has changed.
One last question before Joost breaks up. Do you have now a different relationship with your newborn or so? Because
oh yeah, oh my God, oh yeah, definitely. I mean, she still triggers me. I think, funny enough, her name is Maya. So what I think she did to me was she allowed me to see the illusion of the mind and the magic of the heart. So she really gives me the two. But no, of course, yeah, it's completely different. Oh, like I'm so glad I didn't kill myself. That's really all I can say, because I can finally feel that joy, that I was looking. I still feel the challenges. That's the funny part. Like, that's what I tell people. It's not like life is all rainbows and unicorns now. Like, I still have my challenges. I still feel unsafe. I still had, like, especially after the lockdown stuff, I really had a relapse, I think. And but again, I had the tools now. I had the awareness. I had the experience. I have memories of feeling safe in my own skin again. So, like, that's, I think the very first MDMA session just gave me that. No other insights besides feeling safe in my own skin. And once I had a memory of that, I can carry that with me. Before, I never had that memory, right? So it's like, for many years, I just didn't remember how to feel safe in my own skin. So, but now I have a fresh memory of that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing this insight with us. Now I see Joost, and whenever I see Joost, I get a smile on my face. But this time it's also because he says, "Eric, we need to stop because there's another session coming up." Now, yeah, right. But Pedram and Michael, you said before the session that you're willing to go to the how to call that, the after session or so, and we have over 200 participants now. They don't fit in that small room where only 30 people can join in. So I sorry for the other guys, because we can continue this conversation and people can chime in and ask questions more on the fly personally with you, Pedram. I'll be there. And then Michael will be there. And Joost, you have a couple of announcements. But first, I wanted to thank Michael for a brilliant overview of where we are in this MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And also Pedram for sharing this personal journey with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Pedram. Yeah, your words say it much more powerfully than any slides or data.
Thank you. We need the science and the story. That's really what I want.
We need both. You're right.
We need both. Yeah, one without the other will not succeed.
Very true.
Pedram, you took the words right out of my mouth. Actually, all three of you did. This was I have to apologize because I know this deserves much more attention, and you deserve some of the interaction. If I see the comments in the chat and in the Q&A, people are really curious to ask more about your experience. And I'm lucky that we have the ability to go into a small room to continue the conversation on video. And thank you very much for being willing to do so. Thank you very much, Pedram. I know we've been in touch, I think, since the same time that you sent this video from Ibiza in gratitude, sharing to the maps, and that Rick shared with us. And so finally, here you are. And I think it's been touching for many people. It's a very touching story. You're very eloquent. You're very good. You're very able to transmit this process. And I'm very grateful for your willingness to do this, to share this with us.
Thank you for giving me the platform. Yes, this is the one that I was the most excited about.
Great to hear. The thing is, we do have to wrap up because this is an actual room. It's a virtual room, but it's an actual room. So we have to close off this room for you guys so the next panelists can join. For everybody, just quickly, for everybody who submitted a question in the Q&A, please keep those questions because they will be lost after we close the Zoom call. So keep those questions, bring them with you to the after talk room, and please continue the discussion there. Thank you very much, and we'll continue in 7-8 minutes with the next two sessions.
So the link is
Thanks,
in the
Joost.
chat, right?
Yes, we've sent them to your email as well, Pedram.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I'll see you later, Pedram and Michael.
Yes, see you soon.